Hello, everyone. I hope you can see me, hear me, and see my PowerPoint. So before I begin, just a brief introduction about myself. My name is Jamal Ghazi. I'm currently enrolled uh, in a clinical psychology program at the Michigan School of Psychology. It's a doc program. I'm also involved in research over there. I have really a deep interest in the human brain and the human mind and human social behavior. Really, anything that has to do with humans, I'm just fascinated by it. It's the reason why I chose this career. And so let's just get right into it. So imagination and its healing powers, the mythopoetic function. Now, also, I want to preface this talk with just some encouragement. And I encourage you to lean into this discussion with an ear that's willing to engage and be interested with the material. So lean in with curiosity. Lean in with the will to learn. And so I have these two quotes here. The first is by Albert Einstein. And Albert Einstein says, imagination is more important than knowledge, for knowledge is limited, whereas imagination embraces the entire world, stimulating progress, giving birth to evolution. The second quote is by Seneca, who says, we suffer more often in imagination than in reality. Now, I selected these two quotes because it depicts this dichotomy between health and pathology of imagination. And so what is imagination? According to the APA, imagination is the faculty that produces ideas and images in the absence of direct sensory data, often by combining fragments of previous sensory experiences into new syntheses. So this definition provides us with the idea that imagination is a mental faculty and it produces concepts and ideas and images, but also it's related to consciousness. Now, this other part is the creative imagination. It's also from the APA. And it says creative imagination is the faculty by which new uncommon ideas emerge, especially when emergence does not seem explicable by the mere combination of existing ideas. The operations of the creative imagination are sometimes explained by the interaction of dormant or non-conscious elements with active conscious thoughts. And this is a perfect example or a perfect depiction of the unconscious. This is where you find dreams, all-like experiences, the religious, spiritual experiences, and even where psychedelic induces these images from the unconscious, or actually psychedelics, it could vary, depends, really. And so we know now what imagination is. And so Koslin formulated four components, four processes of imagination. And so the first one is generation. It's the capacity to create mental images without a perceived stimulus. So for example, someone can either look at a picture, walk away from the picture, and still hold the image in mind, or create an image from stored information. The second one is maintenance, the ability to hold and maintain an image in short-term memory. The interesting thing about holding an image in mind is that it lasts for about 250 milliseconds, and then it begins to decay rapidly. And this is the same. It's akin to the same time that we make eye movements, and so it's really, really quick. So we can see here that there's a relationship with mental imagery and the visual system. Inspection is the ability to explore the image that is created. So if you imagine a house, you can inspect its spatial properties or detailed items within it. And the fourth one is transformation, the ability to modify the image. This is examined by mentally rotating images and restructuring them. Okay. And so I created this continuum of imagination really just to show that imagination and the visual system are associated with one another. And so you have on one end no visual perception, and then on the other hand, psychosis. And individuals who are in a psychotic state are unable to discern what's in their fantastical and imaginative mind from reality. And the individuals who are unable to produce any visual perception or actually see things are considered blind or diagnosed, or they're either considered blind or since they can't see. Now, there's a sweet spot right here in the middle that really has mental imagery, daydreaming, dreams, and all like mystical experiences that we briefly touched on. And in that spot is some individuals can't produce mental imagery like aphantasias, or individuals who are diagnosed with aphantasia. They can't produce any mental imagery. And so really this continuum is just to show that there's an association between the visual system and the mental, the visual mental system. And that if you're blind, you're unable to produce images. And if you're too far into the depths of the psyche and its imaginative play, then you're unable to discern reality. And so in order to understand imagination, we have to understand something fundamental about the visual system. Our ability to see is measured by one experiment called binocular rivalry. And so binocular rivalry is an experiment that's done in a lab where two distinct images or information are entering the eye simultaneously. And so you have blue patterns and red patterns, and the observer is only aware of one image at a time. And so there's a random switching between each eye. So there's a rivalry. And this creates a competition for dominance. And this dominance it's a competition for attention, really. And the brain is constantly adapting to this information. And so the way we see is by our visual system constantly blending in visual information over time, every second, every minute, every day. And you can see this here on the graph at the right side, at the right-hand side, where the patterns blend in at moments. And so both eyes see things slightly different. And so they blend the information to allow us to narrow our precision and pinpoint exactly what to focus on. An example of this is when you walk into a random room, your eyes will randomly compete for something to grip them. And then you become focused and attentive to that thing. So this experiment provides us with some indication on how we see, at least how we pay attention. And so our eyes are competing for something to engage with and make sense of, especially when we are in an unfamiliar place. So how does this relate to imagination? So Pearson and his colleagues took this same exact experiment and simply told the participants to imagine a colored pattern prior to actually seeing that colored pattern. So here we have blue and red patterns. They told the participants, imagine you are seeing a blue pattern. And so they imagined they were seeing a blue pattern, and then they performed some task. And then the experimenters flashed the pattern colors quickly on and off. And then they asked the participants what they saw. The participants said they saw the blue pattern, the one that they had imagined. The data they collected were strong indications that it was not by chance of them imagining the color and then actually seeing it. So they imagined the color, they did something, and then they flashed the pattern colors, and then they asked them, what did they see? And they said that they saw what they had imagined. And so what they concluded by this study is that what you imagine is what you tended to see. So the content in your imagination will create a bias of visual content. And so this allows you to focus on specific things. So the significance of this finding is that what you imagine determines how you see the world. So when you imagine something about a specific object, it changes how you see it. And that determines how you engage with it. And so you experience this even when you're not looking at an object. So if you're sitting in a dark room for a while, your mind will begin to conjure up all sorts of things, attempting to map themselves onto what's there in that dark. Another thing is, if you were to see a chair, at some moments in your house, it could be a stool. You could use it to reach things. And so your mind can, the way you see it, the way you imagine it to be, determines how you really see it and how you engage with it. And really, that's the point I want to emphasize on, is that what you imagine determines how you see the world. And this is really why I started this project. It's because of that specific finding. It's extremely important to really put it into the psychotherapeutic world. And so this is what we'll be unfolding and unpacking as we go on. And so an example of this is when you see, signs, logos, symbols, and really anything we could visually see. So when you see these signs, you barely have to read it. It's essentially imprinted visually in your psyche. You see it slightly and you know what to do instantaneously. You stop. When you stop, you partially stop because you read the sign, but the other part, you utilize your imagination to say, if I don't stop, it could result in something disastrous. And so your imagination will conjure up simulations of possibilities. And this puts you in a position to make a decision, leading to adjusting your behavior. It happens so rapidly. That this ability is hidden in plain sight. It's hidden all over us. And so when we begin to create simulations of different scenarios, these scenarios appear as though they are random. However, they are only random in relation to its stimuli. For example, seeing this stop sign, you will have images of or scenarios related to the stop sign. What's interesting about this is that we do it to each other all the time based on surface level things, the way people dress, the way they talk, what statements they made, what activities they're into. We begin to produce images and narrative about the person without actually having any evidence for it. This is done in politics, even everyday social discourse. We try to fill in the gap of what we see and what we don't know by imagining what we think they are most similar to. So a good question to ask is, how does this work? How do we make decisions based on our imaginative capacity? I mean, we kind of have an idea, but let's really ground it into psychological theory. And so in Gestalt field of perception, the variety of complexity coming from the world is filtered by our ability to fill in missing information between what is there and what it could be. So this is also the same idea. So there's a variety of complex information coming in from the world, and it's filtered by our ability to fill in missing information between what is there and what it could be. And so now this filtration system of trying to make sense of all this complexity is organized by the law of similarity. And so the law of similarity is a principle of association, stating that like produces like. Encountering or thinking about something, like one's birthday month, it tends to bring to mind other similar things, like other people other people who you know have the same birthday. So the law of similarity is fundamental to associationism. And really, this is how that works. So let's take a practical example here. Imagine a cup is right in front of you, and you looked at it, and you don't know what it is. It's the first time you've ever seen this thing. But now you know that it's a cup because you associate it to things that are like it. And so you imagine that, oh, okay, it looks like these things that are identified as a cup. And so you box it in and you categorize it in there. And this is really, we love to do this. We love to categorize things. We love to categorize things, experiences, foods, artists, musicians, athletes, personality traits, behaviors, just really everything we encounter, we compare it to something, and we compare it to something we've experienced, and we try to box it in, we limit it. And there is some use for this. However, that's a different topic. For example, in psychological terms, we often take a small behavior of someone and catastrophize it into a personality, leaving us with remarks that sound like this based off of just one behavior they did. Oh, did you see the way they put that cup down? Oh, that person's really aggressive. And so we automatically conjure up a simulation of who they are and what they are like. Now, we love doing this to other people, but hate it when it's done to us because it's limiting. And no one likes to be limited. We all know how complex we are. And so it's not a humanistic perspective if you tend to do that. And so this is why imagination is phenomenological by nature, since we take surface level qualities and reflect them as inner qualities. And so imagination and development. So in developmental years, children indulge in fantasy play, where they experience different identities. They act like monsters or dragons. They make noises like cats and dogs. They hop like frogs. They sometimes act as mommy and daddy. They even act as each other. So imagination is deeply rooted in our being. And it's rooted in our being of trying to find a place in the world. And so children use their imagination to create novel entities and events. They indulge in identity play. They have impersonation of imagined characters. And some children even have imaginary companions. And so a child's mind is mythically oriented. It loves stories. It loves depictions. It loves images. And you can see this in their toys. You can see this in their movies, artistic work, and the way they play and interact with one another. And so here's some data on mental imagery and pro-social behaviors. Now, I just want to shift slightly to some of this data on how imagination affects decision-making and really ultimately behavior. And so Gazer and his colleagues really emphasized on this idea of moral imagination. And they also incorporate a theory of mind, but I'll just focus on the imagination aspects. So in this experiment, the participants were presented with a series of brief stories describing everyday events that featured a person in need of help. And these events were, so like the person in the story found themselves locked outside of their house, or their dog did not return for a long time, or hasn't returned yet. And so then they were provided with 60 seconds to imagine helping these individuals in future situations. So the event of helping them would take place in a setting that they were either familiar with or unfamiliar with. And as you can see here on the graphs, there's a strong context condition and a weak context condition. And the strong is associated with a familiar place, and the weak context is associated with an unfamiliar place. So like a familiar place would be if they were to be in a building, they would choose a room that they are familiar with. And the unfamiliar context would be places like the Grand Canyon, the San Francisco Bridge, places that they're just unfamiliar with. And so the event of helping them would take place in a and so across three experiments, they found that people are more willing to help others in familiar situations after imagining helping them in those situations. What's also interesting is that they found that simulating situations where the individual is contributing in pro-social behaviors such as charity provided implications for ethical decisions and ethical decision making. And so part of the study, they had individuals imagine providing charity, giving charity. And what they found was the individuals who did that were more likely to be charitable and give charity. And so articulated fantasies of helping others increases the likelihood of engaging in morally acceptable behaviors. Now, if we go back to the idea of what we imagine determines what we see, then this makes a lot of sense. So you imagine helping others, and this affects the way you see others. Maybe you see them less suspicious. Maybe you see them less non-threatening. And you're more likely to engage when you see them in that way. And so this increases your ability to engage in social interaction. So it has to come from within you. This next study here is somewhat similar. Mental imagery as a motivational amplifier. And in this study, it's by Renner and his colleagues, and they tested the hypothesis that mental imagery promotes motivation and behavioral engagement by planning pleasant and rewarding activities. And so the participants were randomized into three groups, as you can see here: motivational imagery, activity reminder, and a no reminder group. And as their hypothesis predicted, the motivational imagery condition group reported higher levels of motivation, anticipated pleasure, and anticipated reward for their planned activities. And you can kind of see a dopamine kick here. And so they also completed more activities than the reminder control group, but the same as the no reminder group, since that group had activities outside the lab as well. And so this was done by administering a number of scales that assessed anxiety, depression, goal completion tasks, and visual imagery. And so they concluded that mental imagery could function as a motivational amplifier to promote and engage in behavioral activities. And so there was a strong clinical implication here to use mental imagery to treat depression and anxiety, especially depression. We use behavioral activation through CBT. Now here I'm offering a different approach, an approach that targets also behavioral activation by utilizing imagination. To sit for a few minutes and imagine the activities you want to accomplish through the week increases the chances of you accomplishing them over time. So if we go back on the idea that what we imagine affects how we see, then when you imagine yourself going to the gym, eating better, being kinder, setting a schedule, you begin to see yourself in that way. And you are more willing to take the initiation of pursuing those imaginative constructs with serious intent. And this was touched on in this last article as well. And so motivational amplifier, it truly amplifies the motivation. It's not that it gives you motivation. It extends your motivation or expands your motivation. That's a better way of thinking about it. And so the previous slides, we touched on how really imagination could affect ethical reasoning, planning, making decisions, and really affecting how we see and behave. Now, imagination and emotions are deeply entrenched in our biology and our overall psychological makeup. When it comes to language, in many ways, it partially suppresses our ability to imagine. When we are focused only on the meaning of words rather than its context and broader light, we fail to use our imagination to extend the word beyond its immediate representation. Here is a diagram on how mentally representing content can evoke stronger emotional arousal than verbally representing it. And so, before I get to that diagram, before I get to this diagram, it relates also to this because imagery evokes emotions in essentially three ways: direct influence on the emotional system. There's an overlap between mental imagery and perceptual information, leading to as-if moments. And so this is done by the mind's eye, because since mental imagery is directly perceiving the world, remember it's associated to the visual system. So you're holding images in mind. It affects how we interact with our environment. And sometimes this can override auditory stimuli, visual stimuli, and verbal stimuli. So when you're caught in a daydream, you're overriding your visual, perceptual, sensories. And so mental imagery could also evoke salient emotional states. And so the third way is by recalling salient emotional memories. And so we tend to do this by recalling autobiographical content. And autobiographical content are linked to emotional content. And so, and this is, the images are universal when prompted to recollect personal events, where when individuals do recollect personal events, they're strongly associated with emotional vigor. And so now if we get to this diagram here, we can see that this bottom-up sensory cue, it's matching, and this top-down control process is attempting to select. So let's take autobiographic, for example. You're trying to match and select content, and you're trying to represent it. And when you represent it through the visual mental representations, you construct an image of emotional instance. And that processing overlaps with perceived events, and it could give you direct contact with the emotional system. Thus, the associations result in action readiness, believability, and attitude to self. So when you mentally represent an event instead of verbally, it's more believable since the emotional content is stronger. And this is what this experiment here, this is what they found. And really it's by Holmes and Matthews, a great experiment where they provided 100 ambiguous events that ended in a negative event that the participants had to listen to or read. So the first group is conditioned to focus only on the meaning of the words, and the second group focused only on the imaginative content. After each event they listened to, the examiners would ask questions that emphasized on their focus for the experiment. For example, they would ask the group who focused on the meaning of words, did you discover the fire before you got to the exit? This is a semantic content. As opposed to the second group who is focusing on the imaginative content, where they would ask them, can you see smoke from the fire when you get to the exit? A mentally visual representation of the question. So they concluded that the group focusing on the imaginative content had increased significantly in anxiety over time. They replicated this and found the same results. Now the experiment switched it up a bit and used positive scenarios instead of negative. They had the same conditions, verbal versus imaginative focus groups. This time, the difference resulted in increased positive affect with the imaginary group, with the imagery group, compared to those verbal group. This is significant when we discuss psychopathology in a short bit. However, I want to emphasize again on the point that we made earlier, that what we imagine changes how we see things. If you were to visually represent stories, reading content, or I would say probably the most important is listening to another person in the capacity of imaginative and fantastical play, it provides a richer and more intense construct. And it's associated more with the emotional pains and the joys. And ultimately, it puts a stamp on meaning, a stamp on life with meaning. It's this idea of attempting to fill in the gap between what we see and what we want to see. We are literally at the present moment, evoking meaning onto things without knowing it. And this is exactly what Viktor Frankl was answering. Is man a product of his environment, or does he have human liberty, a spiritual freedom that unhinges him beyond physical boundaries? And I quote, "The experiences of camp life show that man does have a choice of action. We who lived in the concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts, comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken away from man, but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way." And so in his book, he describes how he would spend time imagining about his childhood, his wife, how he would often wonder if things had changed in his neighborhood. He also imagined accomplishing future goals like teaching and writing this book. And this is how he wrote Man's Search for Meaning. There's another quote that I was reluctant to put on there, but because I couldn't find its source, but it's attributed to another person named Stephen Covey. And this person ascribes it to Frankl since he found it in Frankl's library. However, the implications of this are thin. And so the quote is, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom." Again, this is remarkable when you consider what we imagine determines how we see things, and that determines how we engage with it. Viktor Frankl saw this in the camps. He saw that when you're surrounded by an environment that is attempting to strip the human condition and constrict it of all its life, you still have a divine spark that's deeply rooted within that allows you to decide how to engage with the world. And that spark is this ability to imagine. And we also see this with individuals who are battling chronic ailments like cancer or severe mood disorders, or even long-term battles with their emotional life, like a form of betrayal or grief. It's in moments of complete dismay that this other portion that I wanted to get into, this mythopoetic function, creative imagination, comes into life, providing a new and different perspective, a perspective in the form of an image that's so emotionally salient that the individual is able to shift their outlook in life, shift their behavior. You hear some of these experiences when someone says to you that they found Jesus, or they had a mystical experience, or they dreamed of a religious experience. It could be during a dream or an aha moment, akin to a mystical experience. And some people even say that this occurs under psychedelic induced states. So William James describes this experience as ineffable, unable to put to words, noetic, provides new information, transient, the experience does not last long, and passive, the subject is under its control. And I put possession there because it grips the individual. And so this is what the religions of the world attempt at doing. They provide a life that is devoted from waking life to sleeping life, with engaging with such images. These images are so powerful that people utter words, pray, behave, think, will even sacrifice their lives for them. We think that they are held beliefs or ideas, so it makes it easy to discard them. But they're much deeper than that. It's simply silly to reduce them to just words. I mean, they encapsulate billions of people, and to say it's just a game of words reduces the impact of how we function as humans. It's essential to explore what this inherently deeply humanistic characteristic of the human condition is, this capacity to imagine, this capacity of a possessive-like quality, an autonomous machination of images that could paralyze you for brief moments and provide you with new information on how to navigate in the world. And so it's only fitting to jump into Jung from this possessive-like quality of how James described it. And Jung says, and Jung describes, actually, he describes it, before I get into the quote, Jung describes it in one of his letters as a common psychological function, not some mystery that is beyond human grasp. So these experiences, that these religious, these dreams, these aha moments, Jung is saying that these are common. These are as common as psychological function. It's not a mystery. And this is really what I'm attempting to do with this talk, is to say that this creative and imaginative faculty is inherently human, like the heart that beats in our chest. And so Jung says there is nothing mysterious or metaphysical about the term transcendent function, which is the mythopoetic function. It means a psychological function comparable in its way to a mathematical function of the same name, which is a function of real and imaginary numbers. The psychological transcendent function arises from the union of conscious and unconscious contents. This idea of imagination and mental imagery and mental disorders. And so we can see here with autobiographical memories that individuals can conjure up false memories and taken to be as true memories. It creates a false narrative built on lies that leads to pathology. Some simple interventions could be like journaling and having a serious intent to revisit what you wrote, to see the narrative for what it is, or even video recording journaling. And so you record yourself and then you revisit that and you see things from how they actually occurred. You also see this with individuals who suffer from PTSD. I mean, they suffer from intrusive thoughts, intrusive flashbacks. A flashback is described as an image contained with emotionally salient power that debilitates the individual. It can even impact sensory perception, including sound and light and sight. Individuals diagnosed with schizophrenia, some form of psychotic disorder, they experience delusions or hallucinations in which they find themselves immersed in in this imaginative world. They're unable to discern reality from it. And then you also have bipolar disorder. It's associated with suicide. Individuals suffering from this have flashes of self-harm in the future. And again, they have flashes of self-harm, and they're more likely to act on that because it increases it over time if it's continuously happening. I mean, these are just some of the things of how intrusive images could be, like OCD, for example. Intrusive images of germs amplified in vividness and construct. It results in washing hands, intrusive images of future threats. Agoraphobia is the same thing. You avoid crowds or tight spaces. And these images are intrusive, and they're amplified in their vividness and construct. They're also emotionally salient. There's fear attached to them. And that fear is resembled to a catastrophe. And so you're either frozen or isolated. You're not going to put yourself in those positions. Social phobia, observer perspective images of embarrassment are amplified. And so you have this third person like view of yourself, that you see yourself as doing embarrassing things, saying embarrassing things, or feeling incompetent, images of being incompetent. And that results in isolation, avoidance, and dysfunction, at least social dysfunction. Specific phobias, images of spiders, snakes, other animals, become amplified and vivid also. And that's what images really do. They really amplify, and as we can see with this next one, with body dysmorphic or eating disorders, they distort the way you see things. And so some of them are pathological in structure. And so we need to be able to understand how we can analyze the details of these pathological imaginative structures. Hypochondriasis, which has changed now, the idea that it's all in your head. Well, these individuals, the way you diagnose hypochondriasis is that you diagnose them by looking at their history. And when you look at their history, they're not content. They've seen it, all kinds of specialists, all types of physicians. They spend hours on the phone because they believe that they have something. They believe that whatever they're seeing in their head, they believe that they have it. Distressing and unwanted emotionally salient images during times of severe and prolonged stress. Again, under stress, you can induce panic. The panic is induced by having this image in your head that you're either in a tight space and you don't want to be here anymore. You go in for an MRI or an fMRI, and you're sitting in there in that capsule, and you're fine for the first maybe 5 minutes. But then after that, the image comes in your head where, oh my, am I stuck in here? And you begin to panic. And so really mental imagery is found across all these mental disorders. And so what are the clinical implications for this? You see, psychotherapy is often thought of as primarily based on verbal exchange, focusing on verbal thought. However, we don't only think in verbal content, we also think in images. Images have been shown to be more emotionally salient than words. Imagery is a key component of symptoms in mental disorders, as shown in the last slide. Therefore, conceptualizing it as a mental faculty that is driving psychopathology is extremely important. We have disordered thoughts, as shown. Well, we also have disordered imagery, as shown. Imagery can induce stronger emotional response, leading to greater risk for disability. The implications of this is deeply embedded in the humanistic tradition. The idea of person-centered is central to evoking pro-social behaviors. We teach and learn to actively listen to others, validate their unique stories and experiences, and normalize their complexities, all to provide a space that is based on cooperation. This is nothing but a morally salient image that we attempt to create and teach and implement in the therapeutic alliance. This evokes the ideal image of what a therapeutic setting should embody. And so CBT focuses on verbal content, thought content, affect, and behavior. Well, we can incorporate imagery into that and see how imagery affects behavior, affect, thought, and verbal content. We can look at the visual representations, the mental visual representations, and their details and their structures. And so how would we go about this? I mean, really, this right here is a really important slide, I would say, especially if someone wants to implement imagery work in their therapeutic setting. So first, you should gather informed consent. And by gathering informed consent, you're also providing information. And the information that you should be providing is that imagination and imagery work has positive and negative aspects to it. And so it's a forewarning when you're providing this, that imagery produces intense emotions. Especially if someone wants to go back into the past and look at a trauma experience or a dream that was really frightening. Those are the images that they will conjure up are emotionally salient. And so you want to have some caution really walking around that, navigating around those waters. And the next thing is proper clinical assessment. And this indicates if the individual is stable enough to address their imagery. Are they stable enough to walk into this image that's been haunting them? Have they been suppressing it for a while? Why does it keep coming up? And so this is to assess the stability if they're able to handle it. And the third one is a mental visual assessment. Are they able to produce images? So you can ask these individuals to look at an image of an image that might produce positive feelings. And so it could be a pet, a lover, a food that they like, really anything that produces a positive feeling, and ask them to hold that image in mind and then invite them after a few minutes later, invite them to describe the vividness and details of that positive image that they were holding in mind. And the third one is the most important one. It's the therapeutic alliance. And this is really why it's most appropriate to have this in the humanistic association, is that the therapeutic alliance, I mean, it's person-centered. This is really person-centered therapy. I mean, this is across all psychotherapeutic schools, that the person-centered alliance or focus produces a therapeutic alliance that is the most powerful and the most powerful in producing positive results and change between two individuals. And the therapeutic alliance has the trust in the alliance. The therapist is able to invoke empathy. And there's a lot of data on emotional empathy to normalize their images, to normalize their experiences of what they see and what they've experienced. Another is to have a unconditional positive regard, a free judgment zone, to really free themselves from judging the other's experiences. Since these are common experiences, they should be treated as unique to the individual and with full transparency and respect. And so if someone's interested in applying imagery work, there's a lot of techniques and a lot of trainings that individuals could get certified in to really practice their ability to provide imagery work. And so some of these are techniques for phobic imagery. So imaginal exposure, systematic desensitization, imagine feared objects until the fear begins to subside. It's not as strong as behavioral exposure. However, we know that, just like the data indicates, over time, you increase the chances of behavioral engagement. And so you begin with imagining and you can move in incremental fashion. Cognitive processing therapy, there's evidence for this with PTSD. They utilize narrative therapy to visually and cognitively represent the experience the individual is suffering from. This provides a better understanding at recognizing cues that evoke intrusive thoughts. Eye movement desensitization reprocessing, EMDR, there's plenty of data on this, where it dampens the emotionally charged memories, these images that you're having, it dampens them. And the interesting thing with EMDR is that it's associated to your visual system. Also, there's goal-directed imagination, and this is it increases the willingness to participate in imagined goals and pursuing them, mitigates the levels of anxiety as well. And also, we should consider that these imaginary work, engaging in these therapeutic training, could really facilitate social engagement. So individuals suffering from social isolation, social withdrawals, or social phobia, you can outline and draw a map on beginning to have them engage in what their fear is. And really, this is the presentation that I have. This is my contact information. Please feel free to email me any questions you have. I would love to answer them. And I would just want to leave you with the last point that I've been hammering throughout this whole presentation, and that is what we imagine determines and changes and influences what we see. If you could really put that in your front and conscious awareness, you can see that we do this unconsciously most of the time, and that it explains for so much of our human behavior. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to hearing from some of you and looking to present in future topics. Thank you.